In the heart of a luxury harbor, $100 million super yacht sits paralyzed like a dying titan, its massive engines completely dead. Vivian Cross, a powerful CEO, stands with arms crossed, her face a mask of contempt for the 10 elite engineers, sweating over their useless laptops. In a dark, oil-stained corner, Lucas, a single father in faded overalls, silently observes the chaos. Vivian throws a defiant glare and a mocking laugh his way. "If you're such a genius, fix it." Cruel laughter erupts across the deck, but no one knows that in just 1 hour the entire harbor will fall into a stunned, absolute silence. The man's name is Lucas Reed. He is 44 years old, a single father with silver-streaked hair and hands that tell 1,000 stories of hard labor, heat, and steel. High above on the sun deck, shielded from the biting words of the elite, his 8-year-old daughter, Hannah, sits quietly. She clutches an old frayed backpack filled with school books, her eyes wide and observant as she watches the chaos below. She doesn't see a maintenance man. She sees the man who makes her breakfast every morning, the man who reads her stories until she falls asleep. To the elite world of the luxury harbor, however, Lucas is a ghost. He is a part-time maintenance worker, hired by the hour to do the dirty, gritty jobs that no one else wants to touch. Today, his task was meant to be invisible. Check the auxiliary drainage pipes. Nothing more. But Lucas isn't just a laborer. Years ago, before the world broke him, he was the lead marine engine specialist for transoceanic vessels, the kind of ships that carry the weight of the world across the dark Pacific. He was a man who could solve problems that computers couldn't even diagnose. A man who spoke the language of iron and fire. The air in the engine room is thick with the smell of unburnt fuel and desperation. Lucas can feel the fever of the machine. He remembers the cold nights on the Atlantic when the engine's pulse was the only thing keeping him alive. Every metal groan feels like a memory he tried to bury. He remembers the violent waves where life and death were separated only by the rhythmic pulse of a piston. He walked away from that world after a tragic, preventable accident at sea took his wife's life. The grief was a weight heavier than any engine block. He chose the quiet life. He chose small jobs and greasy overalls so he could be there to pick Hannah up from school, to cook her simple dinners, and to be the stable foundation she needed. He traded his ambition for his daughter's smile, bearing his talent under layers of modesty and silence. The woman standing at the center of the storm is Vivian Cross. At 38, she is the iron-willed CEO of a global shipping empire and the owner of this mechanical beast. Vivian is a woman who was raised to believe that money and commands move the world. She has never known the value of waiting, and she has never known the value of a man she couldn't buy. To her, every person is a tool, and right now her tools are broken. She has a high-stakes voyage planned with international partners, a deal that could define her legacy or destroy her company. But the engine, the very heart of her power, has stopped beating. It isn't just a breakdown, it's an insult to her authority. 10 engineers were summoned from the most prestigious marine firms in the country. They arrived in sleek black cars with high-end laptops, diagnostic sensors, and an overwhelming sense of arrogance. They have been debating in circles for 3 hours, their voices growing louder as their confidence shrinks. They have checked the fuel lines, the electronic injectors, the software boards, and the fiber optic sensors. They have run every simulation, followed every protocol, and consulted every manual. Yet the engine remains cold, silent, and mocking. Vivian's patience has long since evaporated, replaced by a jagged blade of sarcasm. She berates the professionals, her voice echoing off the stainless steel walls of the engine room. "I pay for excellence, not excuses," she snaps, her eyes flashing like flint. Lucas stands at the very edge of the space, a silent observer in the shadows. He doesn't interrupt. He doesn't offer unsolicited advice. He simply watches. He watches the vibrations of the cooling fans, the way the light reflects off the oil seals, and he listens to the way the air moves through the vents. He sees the fundamental mistakes they are making. They are looking at the digital representation of the machine on their screens, but they aren't looking at the machine itself. They are treating it like a math problem, but Lucas knows it's a living, breathing entity of friction and heat. He remains invisible, a man with a forgotten secret, waiting for the moment when the experts finally run out of lies to tell. The lead engineer, a man named Marcus who boasts 3 doctoral degrees and 20 years of consulting, finally sighs and shuts his laptop with a definitive click. His forehead is beaded with sweat that hasn't come from physical labor, but from the heat of Vivian's gaze. He turns to her, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights, and delivers the verdict. They need to replace the entire primary control module and perhaps the main crankshaft sensor array. It is a catastrophic diagnosis. It will cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in parts alone, but more importantly, it means weeks of downtime. The yacht would have to be towed, the deck cut open, and the heart of the ship replaced. Vivian explodes. The cost of the parts is a mere footnote to her, but the time is an utter disaster. "I have the most expensive technical team in the hemisphere in this room," she screams, her voice cracking with fury. "And you're telling me that the only solution is to tear my ship apart? Is there not a single person in this entire harbor who actually knows how a motor works? Or are you all just glorified IT technicians in fancy shirts?" Her eyes scan the room, searching for a victim, landing on the engineers who suddenly find the grease stains on their shoes very interesting. Lucas takes one step forward from the shadows. The heavy thud of his work boots on the metal floor draws every eye. It is the sound of reality intruding upon a world of theory. "Let me listen to the starter," he says quietly. His voice isn't loud, but it carries a weight of absolute, unshakable certainty. The room goes dead silent. The contrast is sharp. The polished, fearful engineers, and the man who looks like he belongs in a scrapyard. Vivian looks him up and down with a slow, agonizing gaze. She notes the thick grease on his chin, the faded fabric of his overalls, and the calloused, oil-stained skin of his hands. She lets out a dry, mocking laugh that feels like a slap. "And who exactly are you? The janitor come to sweep up the broken dreams of these experts?" Lucas doesn't flinch. He doesn't look at the engineers who are now snickering behind their hands, emboldened by their boss's cruelty. "I'm just a man who knows how to listen to engines," he replies, his eyes locked onto hers, refusing to drop his gaze. "And Ms. Cross, machines don't lie the way those numbers on your screens do." Marcus, the lead engineer, laughs out loud, a harsh, condescending sound. "He listens to them. Did you hear that? Maybe he talks to the pistons too? Does the fuel pump tell you its secrets, old man? This is a Tier 4 common rail diesel system with computerized timing, not a lawnmower from the 1970s. Go back to your pipes before you hurt yourself. Don't let your grease stains ruin this luxury deck." Vivian is tired, frustrated, and looking for a way to vent her rage. She sees in Lucas an opportunity for a cruel distraction. She pulls out her smartphone, a gold-plated device, and switches on the high-definition recording feature. She is broadcasting the scene directly to her internal corporate feed, showing her board members and partners how low she has had to stoop. She points a trembling, manicured finger at the massive engine block. "All right, Mr. Listener, if you're such a hidden genius, if you're the hero we've all been waiting for, then fix it. Show these experts, with their degrees and their millions in equipment, how it's done. But if you fail, you and your daughter leave this harbor tonight. No more jobs. No more listening." Lucas nods slowly, his jaws set. He thinks of Hannah sitting on the deck, and the fire in his soul reignites. He remembers why he became a father, to protect her. And right now, protecting her means winning this impossible bet. He doesn't defend his honor or list his credentials. He simply sets his tattered rag aside. "I'll need one thing," he says. "Turn off all auxiliary power. Kill the generators. I need total, absolute silence." The engineers protest immediately, their voices rising in a chorus of indignation. They claim it's dangerous, that it will crash the remaining systems, that it's against every safety protocol in the book. Marcus steps forward to stop him, his face red with anger. "This is insane. You'll blow the control boards. Ms. Cross, you can't let an amateur ruin this vessel." But Vivian silences the room with a sharp, terrifying wave of her hand. She wants to see this man fail. She wants to see him crumble under the weight of his own perceived arrogance so she can justify her anger. Do it, she commands. Kill the power. Let the genius have his silence. The lights in the engine room dim and then vanish, replaced by the dim flickering glow of emergency lanterns. The constant, high-pitched humming of the electronics dies away, leaving a heavy, unnatural silence that seems to press against the ears like deep-sea pressure. Vivian crosses her arms, a cynical, predatory smile playing on her lips, as she watches the man in the greasy overalls step into the dark, silent heart of the machine. The engine room is now a tomb of cold steel and long shadows. Lucas doesn't move toward the control consoles or the diagnostic ports. He ignores the million-dollar sensors still dangling from the engine block like useless jewelry. Instead, he walks slowly toward the massive, shivering block of the main engine. He moves with a reverence that borders on the religious, his boots clanking softly on the deck. He leans in, placing his bare palm against the vibration-dampening mount, feeling the residual warmth of the failed attempts. Then slowly, he presses his ear directly against the cold, metal casing of the number 4 cylinder head. He closes his eyes. To the engineers watching on the monitors through infrared cameras, he looks like a lunatic, a man trying to hear the ocean in a seashell. But to Lucas, the world has narrowed down to a single point. He isn't hearing noise. He is feeling the soul of the machine. He is tracing the pathways of oil and the tension of the bolts. He is searching for the discord in the symphony. Crank the engine for exactly 3 seconds, Lucas commands, his voice muffled against the steel. Not a heartbeat longer. Then stop. The engineers exchange glances of pure mockery, but Vivian's icy stare forces them to the console. Marcus presses the starter with a smirk. The engine groans, a heavy, stuttering, metallic struggle that sends a violent shudder through the hull, and then falls silent as the power is cut. Lucas doesn't move. He stays pressed against the metal, listening to the way the heat dissipates, the way the metal clicks as it settles back into place. Again, he says, his voice a low growl that commands the room. 3 seconds. They do it again, and a third time. The tension in the room has shifted from mockery to a strange, uncomfortable curiosity. The silence that follows the third crank is thick enough to choke on. Lucas is sweating now, the heat of the engine radiating into his face. Marcus can't help himself. He scoffs loudly, desperate to regain his status. This is a waste of my time. It's an electronic fault in the sub-millisecond timing map. You cannot hear a software bug in 1,000 lines of code, you fool. Give up before you embarrass yourself further. You're just putting on a show. Lucas opens his eyes. His gaze is no longer that of a maintenance man. It is sharp, piercing, and terrifyingly intelligent. The gaze of a man who has mastered the elements. He stands up straight, wiping a smudge of oil from his forehead with a thumb. It is not an electrical fault, he says, his voice ringing with an authority that makes Marcus actually flinch. And it isn't the software. You're looking for ghosts in the wires when the problem is in the bone. You're so dependent on machines that you've forgotten how to feel the metal. Oh, really? Marcus sneers, though his voice lacks its earlier bite. Then what is it, mister? Genius. What did the ghost in the machine tell you? Lucas doesn't answer with words. He walks toward the rear of the engine, toward the secondary transmission shaft, a part of the machine that the elite team hadn't even bothered to inspect because the sensors said it was green. He begins to speak, and as he does, his voice transforms. He explains the phenomenon of pressure sink deviation. He describes how a minute, microscopic vibration in the auxiliary high-pressure line is creating a harmonic resonance. This resonance, he explains, is tricking the digital sensors into sensing a phantom catastrophic failure, triggering a hard safety shutdown before the engine can even cycle. Vivian's cynical smile has completely vanished. She doesn't understand the complex physics of what he's saying, but she understands the tone of a man who is standing on solid ground. She sees the lead engineers looking at each other, their faces turning from pale to ashen. They recognize the terms. They recognize the terrifying logic. They realize they were outclassed by a man with an ear to the iron. Lucas reaches into the pocket of his greasy overalls and pulls out a small tarnished wrench. Not a high-tech tool, but one that has been worn smooth by years of use. He focuses on a single tiny bolt hidden deep behind a cooling shroud, a bolt that requires he contort his body to reach. The room is silent, save for the sound of his heavy breathing and the clink of metal on metal. With the precision of a master surgeon, he loosens the bolt just a fraction of a turn. He reaches in with a pair of needle-nose pliers and with a slow, steady hand, pulls out a tiny silver sliver of metal. It is no thicker than a leaf, a stray piece of machining debris from the factory that had finally vibrated into the wrong place at the wrong time. It was a manufacturing defect, a ghost that no computer sensor was programmed to find. He holds the sliver up in the dim light of an emergency lantern. The engineers are paralyzed, their mouths hanging open. Lucas doesn't gloat. He doesn't look at Marcus. He simply replaces the bolt, tightening it not with a digital torque gauge, but by the feel of the metal, a tactile wisdom that takes 20 years of failure and success to master. He stands back, wipes his hands on his rag, and looks directly at the bridge. "Start the engine," he says. Marcus hesitates, his hand trembling over the button. He looks at Vivian. She doesn't say a word. She just stares at Lucas. Marcus presses it. The engine doesn't just start, it roars to life with a primal, ferocious energy. It transitions instantly into a deep, soulful, perfect hum that vibrates through the deck, through the hull, and into the very bones of everyone standing in the room. It is the sound of absolute, unyielding mechanical harmony. The engine room is alive again, flooded with bright LED light and the magnificent rhythmic thrumming of the motor. The 10 elite engineers stare at their laptop screens in disbelief, watching as every single diagnostic needle swings into the green. Every temperature, every pressure, every timing map is now flawless. The catastrophic failure has vanished like a bad dream. They look at each other, then at the man in the greasy overalls, and then at the floor. Not a single one of them can find a word to justify their hours of arrogant failure. Their degrees, their titles, and their expensive sensors had failed where a man with a tattered rag and a keen ear had succeeded. Vivian Cross stands frozen by the rail, the golden smartphone still in her hand. The mockery is gone, stripped away by the raw, undeniable power of the engine's roar. The condescension that has defined her life has been replaced by a crushing, humiliating weight of realization. She looks at the tiny piece of silver metal in Lucas's hand, a piece of trash that almost cost her a company, then at the calm, tired face of the man she had just ridiculed in front of her entire corporate network. "How?" she asks. Her voice is no longer a command or a weapon. It is a whisper, cracked and vulnerable. "How did you find what they couldn't with all their technology? I spent millions on those devices." Lucas doesn't look at the engineers, who are now avoiding his eyes. He doesn't look at the camera that is still recording his victory. He simply continues to wipe his hands, the grease staining the rag even darker. "Technology is a map," he says quietly, his voice barely audible over the engine. "But a map isn't the territory. Most people try to tell the engine what's wrong based on what they want to see on their screens. I just stopped talking and let the engine tell me what was hurting. You can't fix a heart if you don't listen to the beat. You were so busy looking for a glitch in the software that you forgot about the soul of the ship." The engineers, suddenly humbled and desperate to save face, begin to scramble. They aren't laughing anymore. They are taking out their notebooks, vowing to record the specifications of the harmonic resonance Lucas described. They realize they aren't just looking at a maintenance man, they are in the presence of a master of a dying art, someone who understands the physical world in a way they never will. Marcus approaches, lowering his head to mutter an apology, but Lucas only nods slightly, without a hint of resentment. Vivian steps toward him, her expensive heels clicking rhythmically on the metal floor. She is a woman who has spent her entire life looking down on people like Lucas, viewing them as interchangeable parts in her vast empire. But now she feels small. She looks at him, and for the first time in her career, she publicly apologizes. Her voice is steady, and she makes sure the recording phone captures every word of her admission. She realizes she didn't just almost lose a $100 million contract, she almost lost the opportunity to recognize a man of true, rare value. I was wrong, she says, her eyes searching his. I judged the book by its cover, and I almost burned the library. You are a genius, Mr. Reed, and I am a fool. I owe you a sincere explanation rather than just a check. She immediately makes him an offer that would make most men scream with joy. She offers him the position of global head of marine engineering for her entire fleet, a salary with more zeros than Lucas has ever seen, a corporate apartment in the city, and a life of total luxury. Lucas looks up toward the sun deck, where Hannah is peering down over the railing, a bright, proud smile on her face that outshines the sun. He looks at his daughter, then back at the woman who just insulted him. Lucas Reed doesn't accept the fancy title. He doesn't want the corner office, the tailored suits, or the corporate jet. He knows that world. He knows how it eats people alive, turns their hearts to stone, and makes them forget what matters. He looks Vivian in the eye and shakes his head, a ghost of a smile on his lips. I don't want your empire, Ms. Cross, he says. I've already lived that life, and it cost me everything I loved. Money can't buy back dinners with my daughter. Vivian is stunned. She can't imagine anyone saying no to the power she's offering. But Lucas isn't most men. He negotiates a different kind of deal, a simple ironclad contract, a steady, well-paid job at the harbor that utilizes his skills, but with one non-negotiable condition that is worth more to him than any salary. He will never work past 4 p.m. He will never work weekends, and he will never be on call during his daughter's birthdays, school plays, or quiet evenings. He trades the potential for millions for the guarantee of being a present, loving father. My time isn't for sale, he tells her. I'm a genius at engines, maybe, but I'm trying to be a genius at being a dad. That's the harder job, and that is a job I am not allowed to fail at. Vivian is silenced by his integrity. She agrees instantly, signing the deal on the spot. She changes that day. She learns a lesson that no elite MBA could ever teach her. The most expensive suit in the room doesn't always belong to the person with the most wisdom. She begins to treat her crew, from the captains to the deckhands, with a newfound, genuine respect. She realizes that her empire isn't built on contracts or software, but on the backs of invisible people like Lucas, who hold everything together with grease-stained hands and quiet dignity. The 10 engineers leave the yacht in a silent, somber procession. They leave with a lesson they didn't learn in their ivory tower universities. True experience cannot be downloaded, and humility is the only door to real expertise. They will go back to their firms, but they will never look at a sensor the same way again. They will always remember the man who fixed a super yacht with a small wrench and a silence that spoke volumes. As the sun begins to dip below the horizon, painting the harbor in shades of violet, gold, and fire, the super yacht finally pulls away from the dock. Its engine purrs like a massive, contented predator, moving the ship toward its destiny with perfect timing. On the pier, Lucas stands with his arm around Hannah's shoulders. She holds his hand, her hero in greasy overalls, who just saved a giant. "Did you fix it, Daddy?" she asks, looking up at him with adoration. "I just listened, Hannah," he says, kissing the top of her head. "I just listened. And from now on, I'll always be here to listen to your stories, too." It wasn't a $1 million computer or a team of PhDs that saved the ship. It was a man who had been ignored, mocked, and cast aside. It was a single dad who knew that true genius doesn't need to shout, doesn't need a stage, and doesn't need an audience. It simply waits for the right moment to speak. Because in a world full of noise, arrogance, and digital screens, the one who truly listens is the only one who truly understands the heartbeat of the world. If you believe you should never judge someone by their position, subscribe for more stories and leave a comment. Do you think experience is more important than technology?